The core of Jorge Luis Borges' short story Funes, His Memory, is in, we could say, the second part or second half of the story. Before that, we get a little bit of framing and prefiguration and recollection. Borges begins by saying, I recall him, though I have no right to speak that sacred verb. Only one man on earth did, and that man is dead. So that is Funes, and the reason why we can't say recall, that's that sacred verb, is because only one person has truly had the powers of recollection that dwarf ours. And I'm not going to go through all of the descriptions that he's going to provide here of Funes, but what we do find out is that the author is contributing to a volume that's going to be published. He says, I applaud the idea that all of us who have had dealings with a man should write something about him. My testimony will perhaps be the briefest and certainly the slightest account in the volume you are to publish, but it can hardly be the least impartial. Unfortunately, I am Argentine and so congenitally unable to produce the dithyramb that is the obligatory genre in Uruguay, especially when the subject is an Uruguayan, right? And then he talks about his first recollection of Funes in March or February of 1884. He sees this young not quite man, a boy, smoking a cigarette, running along a sidewalk, and somebody shouts to him, "What's the time, Ireneo?" Without consulting the sky, without a second's pause, the boy replied, 4 minutes till 8, young Bernardo Juan Francisco. And so the narrator says, I'm so absent-minded I would never have given a second thought to the exchange I've just reported. Had my attention not been called to it by my cousin, who was prompted by a certain local pride and the desire to see him unfazed by the other boy's trinomial response, naming the person's entire name. He told me that the boy in the narrow street was one Ireneo Funes, and that he was known for certain eccentricities, among them shying away from people, and always knowing what time it was, like a clock, right? So that goes on for a bit, and then there is an accident. Funes is already chronometric, meaning that he has sort of a natural notion of what time it is. He already has great capacities of memories. But what we find out is he's been crippled by a falling off of a horse, a half-broken horse, and he never stirs from his cot, his eyes fixed on the fig tree behind the house or on a spider web. At dusk, he would let himself be carried to the window. He was such a proud young man, he pretended his disastrous fall had actually been fortunate. And we'll see why he thinks so in a moment. So what ends up happening next is the narrator receives a letter from Funes. He's been studying Latin, and he's brought with him De Viris Illustribus, the great, stories of great men, Quiteret's Thesaurus, Julius Caesar's Commentaries, and an odd-numbered volume of Pliny, Naturalis Historia, which he says, that goes beyond my skills as a Latinist. And there are no secrets in a small town. Ireneo, in his house on the outskirts of the town, soon learned of the arrival of these outlandish books. He sent me a flowery letter reminding me of our lamentably ephemeral meeting on the 7th of February, 1884. He talks about other things, and then he asks, will you send me one of these books that you have, and also a dictionary, because at this point in time I must plead ignorance of Latin. We will find out towards the end that actually he effortlessly learned English, French, Portuguese, and Latin. So this is part of that. Now the narrator has to return home to Buenos Aires. His father is ill, so he says, I've got to go and get my books back from Funes. And this is where we get to the conversation. So he goes in and meets Ireneo in the back room, and he hears Ireneo's high mocking voice. The voice was actually speaking Latin with morbid pleasure. The voice emerging from the shadows was reciting a speech or a prayer or an incantation. Turns out it's actually from the 7th book of Pliny's Naturalis Historia. So Ireneo tells him to come in, and they have a conversation. And the narrator tells us, I come now to the most difficult point in my story, a story whose only raison d'etre, as my readers should be told from the outset, is that dialogue half a century ago. I will not attempt to reproduce the words of it, which are now forever irrecoverable. Instead, I will summarize faithfully the many things Ireneo told me. Indirect discourse is distant and weak. I know that I am sacrificing the effectiveness of my tale. I only ask my readers try to hear in their imagination the broken and staccato periods that astounded me that night. So, what happens in the conversation? A lot. And now we get to the real meat of the story. So Funes begins by narrating or enumerating in both Latin and Spanish the cases of prodigious memory cataloged in the Naturalis Historia. Cyrus, the king of Persia, who could call the soldiers in his armies by name, Mithridates, Eupator, who meted out justice in the 22 languages of the kingdom over which he ruled, and we can go on and on and on with this. And what is Funes' take on this? Why are people so amazed by this? This isn't amazing at all. Why? Because he possesses a memory that makes those look like nothing. He says, before that afternoon when the blue roan had bucked him off, he'd been what every man was, blind, deaf, befuddled, virtually devoid of memory. I tried to remind him how precise his perception of time, his memory for proper names had been. He ignored me. Funes lived, he said, for 19 years as though in a dream. He looked without seeing, heard without listening, forgot everything, or virtually everything. When he fell, he'd been knocked unconscious. When he came to again, the present was so rich, so clear, that it was almost unbearable, as were his oldest and even his most trivial memories. It was shortly afterward he learned he was crippled. Of that fact, he hardly took notice. He reasoned that immobility was a small price to pay. Now, his memory and perception were perfect. And here is where we get to some speculations. What would it be like for a human being to have that kind of memory and perception? And Borges, imagines that for us. He says, with one quick look, you and I perceived 3 wine glasses on a table. Funes perceived every grape that had been pressed into the wine and all the stalks and tendrils of its vineyard. Now, he'd have to have seen the vineyard ahead of time. He knew the forms of the clouds in the southern sky on the morning of April 30th, 1882, and could compare them in his memory with the veins in the marbled binding of a book he'd seen only once, or the feathers of spray lifted by an oar on the Rio Negro on the eve of the Battle of Quechabrajo. Nor were those memories simple. Every visual image was linked to muscular sensations, thermal sensations, and so on. He was able to reconstruct every dream, every daydream he'd ever had. 2 or 3 times he'd reconstructed an entire day. He had never once erred or faltered, but each reconstruction had itself taken another day because it's totally faithful to it. So he says, I myself alone have more memories than all mankind since the world began. Also, my dreams are like other people's waking hours. And again, towards dawn, my memory, sir, is like a garbage heap. A circle drawn on a blackboard, a right angle, a rhombus. All these are forms we can fully intuit. Ireneo could do the same with the stormy mane of a young colt, a small herd of cattle on a mountainside, a flickering fire in its uncountable ashes, and the many faces of a dead man at a wake. I have no idea how many stars he saw in the sky. So think of what it would be like to have that sort of perception. You're constantly making new memories, and then memories that you can recall at will of all these things in perfect detail as if they were the same as perceptions. So that is quite something. We go on from this, and we find that Funes has projects. He told me that in 1886, he'd invented a numbering system, original with himself, and within a few days, he'd passed the 24,000 mark. He hadn't written it down. He doesn't have to. Anything he does, he remembers perfectly. And his original motivation, I think, was his irritation that the 33 Uruguayan patriots should require 2 figures and 3 words rather than a single figure, a single word. He then applied this, as Borges will call it, mad principle to the other numbers. And he gives us some examples. Instead of 7,013, he would say, for example, Maximo Perez. Instead of 7,014, the railroad. Other numbers were Louis Melian, Lafiner, Olimar, Sulfur, Clubs, The Whale, Gas, Astupat, Napoleon, Augustin de Vedia. Instead of 500, he said 9, which shows you a certain absurdity there. Each word had a particular figure attached to it. The latter ones were extremely complicated. Now, the narrator tells us, I tried to explain to Funes that his rhapsody of unconnected words was the opposite of a number system. I told him that when one said 365, one said 300s, 6 tens, 5 ones, a breakdown impossible with a number like a poncho full of meat. But Funes could not or would not understand me. Funes is a Superman in a certain respect, but he's also quite limited in other respects. He's gone beyond mankind. And here Borges will bring up a speculation by John Locke of an impossible language in which each individual being, every stone, every bird, every branch, would have its own name. Locke postulated this and condemned it. That can't possibly be. Funes rejected it for the opposite reason. He contemplated a similar language, but discarded the idea as too general and ambiguous. Why? Because Funes remembered not only every leaf of every tree and every patch of forest, but every time he'd perceived or imagined that leaf. And then Funes has this interesting project of trying to reduce each past day to a body of 70,000 different recollections, which then would be defined by numbers. So he's going to carry out a sort of reduction. And he says 2 considerations dissuaded him: the realization the task was interminable and the realization it was pointless. By the time he died, he would still not have finished classifying all the memories of his childhood. So, a very interesting but unrealizable project. And so Borges will say the 2 projects that I've mentioned, an infinite vocabulary for the natural series of numbers, and a pointless mental catalog of all the images of his memory, are foolish, even preposterous on the one hand, but they reveal a certain halting grandeur. They allow us to glimpse or to infer the world that Funes lived in. And what is that world? So he tells us that Funes is virtually incapable of general or Platonic ideas. What does this mean? It gives us an example. The generic symbol dog was difficult for him to see, that it took in all the dissimilar individuals of all shapes and sizes. It irritated him the dog of 3:14 in the afternoon, seen in profile, should be indicated by the same noun as the dog of 3:15, seen frontally. So Funes literally has too much to process. All he grasps are really particulars. Now, this raises a problem of narration. How is it that Funes is even able to communicate at all? And that's not actually going to be discussed in here, but it's something that we might think of as readers. He talks as well about Funes not being very good at thinking. He suspects that. Why? Because to think is to ignore or forget differences, to generalize, to abstract. In the teeming world of Ireneo Funes, there was nothing but particulars, and they were virtually immediate particulars. Now, Funes, as we find out, does not live very long. He will die in 1889, so just a few years after this conversation, this brief conversation. There's hints that many people knew Funes far better than the narrator, but this is the only glimpse that we get of this person with perfect perception and perfect memory, and what that might be like, and whether he can communicate any of this to us mere limited mortals, the kind of people that you and I know ourselves and take ourselves to be, and which Borges does as well.